The High Weald has one of the highest concentrations of 18th century and earlier timber frame buildings anywhere in Europe. The timber for these buildings all came from the local woods. We're now standing in front of one of the defining buildings of the Wealden farm. In fact, one of the defining buildings of any farm in England, which is the barn. This barn presents itself to us as a building really with no windows. In the centre is a very large pair of double doors that lead into a central bay for threshing out the corn. This brings us on to the major function of the barn. Now, we're all familiar, of course, with the importance of the corn harvest. Now, the harvested corn would have been brought into the farm and stacked in a yard, and also stacked, where possible, in the bays of the barn that flank this central door and porch. And the sheaves of corn were then, over the winter months, were then gradually pulled into this central bay area and threshed out with flails. And this threshing process separated the ears of corn from the stalks. And the corn was then also winnowed in this central bay. Opposite these double doors are another pair of double doors. The double doors would have been thrown open and the corn thrown into the air and the husks separated from the grain. And the grain was then put into sacks and taken to the granary. So the barn was a critical building for the farmyard. It served not only to store the harvested corn, but also to process it over the winter months. One absolutely key byproduct of threshing out the corn was, of course, straw. And the straw was gradually brought out into the farmyard here, and it was trodden down by the cattle that were accommodated in these shelter sheds to either side and turned into manure. And the manure would have then been returned back to the farmland to fertilize it. So that brings us again to another critically important function of the barn and of the farmyard, which was to turn the harvested corn crop into grain, but also back into manure to fertilize the land again. The buildings that flank the yard were open-fronted cattle sheds. As you can see, these open-fronted cattle sheds have been greatly adapted in the 20th century for garages and for workshops. However, the overall plan of this farmyard still remains, and it is an important part of the character of Hazelden Farm as a whole. Despite their appearance, barns in the Weald, on closer examination, often turn out to have actually been very multifunctional buildings. They didn't just serve to store and process the corn crop. Because if you go inside barns, you will often find holes and other sort of features in the timber work inside these buildings, which indicates where there were floors and partitions. And many of these floors and partitions served to take haylofts and areas for stalling cattle and horses. In the High Weald, as in many other parts of England, barns were very multifunctional buildings. It was a very common practice in the 19th century for many of these internal partitions to be ripped out. So the general impression now is that barns were simply open spaces. But in fact, if you look at them more closely, you can see how they've developed. And understanding how they've developed really can inform, for example, the way you would go about reusing these buildings for other purposes. Many Weald barns have been adapted and added to over the centuries. It was very common to add lean-to shelters for cattle and other buildings to barns. What we see here on the left is a brick wall at the ground floor. And that indicates that this barn has had some alteration to it in the 19th century. And sure enough, when we go inside, we find that there are fragments of a plaster ceiling. And in fact, these fragments of a plaster ceiling made up a kiln which occupied the upper floor of the barn above the brick ground floor. The forms and scales of buildings are fundamental to how we read architecture in any landscape, and the High Weald is no exception to that. In fact, the buildings of the High Weald are very strongly characterized by the sweeps of their roofs. Here on the right we have a half-hipped roof, and as we swing round to the left to look at the porch, the central porch to the barn, we can see a fully hipped roof. Hipped and half-hipped roofs are an essential part of the vocabulary of farmstead architecture and domestic architecture in the Weald, and indeed across large parts of the southeast of England. And another absolutely fundamental aspect is the dominance of the house, the barn and the oast house in the farmstead group. The other buildings are typically single-storey and, if you like, are secondary in terms of the hierarchy of forms within the farmstead